Hey guys, thank you so much for joining me for Hope Church Online. I know that we are still meeting face to digital face, but whether you are watching this in the comfort of your living room, gathered around the computer screen or your television, or maybe you're listening to this via our podcast on your commute to work or as you're walking or running through your community, thank you so much for giving us the time to be able to be together, to just take a deep inhale and exhale together and see what God has to say to us today in our time with one another. We are in week 2 of our 3-week series where we are talking about the nature and the character of God. And last week we looked at God's name, Yahweh. We looked at Exodus chapter 34, where Moses has this incredible encounter with God, and he goes before Moses and he declares his name, Yahweh, Yahweh, the Lord, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and in graciousness and faithfulness to thousands, forgiving the iniquity and the sin of multitudes of people. And we just looked at how that same Yahweh is the Yahweh that wants to be in relationship with us. This week, we're actually going to back up a chapter and begin in Exodus chapter 33. And we're going to be looking at what it looks like to live in the presence and in the community and in the beauty of this Yahweh God. A few weeks ago, when I was just kind of in the midst of just ultimate despair and having a hard time with regards to quarantine and trying to figure out which way is up, I started running. And I am not a runner, but I run, if that makes any sense whatsoever. And not too long into my running, I actually did something to my knee and I hurt it really bad. And it hurt to walk. It hurt to go up and down stairs. Everything was impacted by the fact that my knee hurt. So I couldn't run at all. So I took a few days off and just began doing some research, trying to figure out, is there something I could do? Is there a way I could run better? What could I do to really make this thing happen? Because I needed to keep running. It was good for me mentally and emotionally and physically. So I needed to keep doing it. And I came across a couple articles, and all the articles said really one of a few things. Either one, you need to lose weight and your knee will stop hurting. And I thought, well, I'm running to lose weight, so that kind of didn't really seem to work. The second thing, it said that if you're running and your joints begin to hurt, it's probably because you're old. That was kind of my paraphrase of it. Basically, the idea is I need to take it easy, which is a hard thing for me to do anyway. But then I finally came across this one article that made a lot of sense. And I thought, man, that's exactly, I could do that. I could actually, try this thing. And what the writer of the article was saying was this, that a lot of times when you're running and your knee begins to hurt, it's because you have bad posture. He said, so try this. Next time you go on your run, lift up your head and lean forward just 5 degrees or so and see what kind of difference it makes. I'm going to tell you, after my knee healed up and I tried that, it made a huge difference. I was not able to only run longer, but I was able to run without pain. I was able to run further. I actually made my best time when it comes to running. It was amazing just by changing my posture when I ran. Well, what I want to do today in our time together is I want to kind of help you look at your posture for life. I think sometimes we encounter such great heartache, and we all have these moments or these seasons of doubt or fear or frustration that I think that many times we could overcome by simply adjusting the posture of our soul or of our mind or of our emotions. And so what I want to do is I want to walk through various passages throughout the Bible that will maybe help us to, lift our head up a little bit or maybe lean forward a little bit and correct some of those posture issues that we may be having in our everyday lives. So here we are in Exodus chapter 33. Now, a little bit of a backstory before we get into this. God had told Moses that they were going to be going into the promised land. And Moses said, God, we don't want to go unless you come with us. And so God says, all right, tell you what, I'm going to go with you. And in Moses, it almost seems like this just kind of out of nowhere question says to God, thank you. I appreciate you going with us. But what I really want is this, and this is where we pick up in Exodus 33, verse 18. Look at this. It says this, Moses said to God, "Please show me your glory." Now, the word for glory there is the Hebrew word chabod, which literally means presence or beauty. Now, a lot of times when we think about glory, we think about being famous or being popular or having a lot of followers. But for Moses understood that just going forward and representing God wasn't enough. Moses wanted to be in the presence, the manifest presence, or the sheer beauty of God. Now, look at what God's response to Moses is in verse 19. It says, "And God said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim before you my name, Yahweh, or the Lord. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. But," he says, "you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." And Yahweh said, "Behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory," that's that chabod, "while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." So here's Moses having this conversation with Yahweh, and he says, "Yahweh, God, I want to see your presence. I want to see your beauty." And God's response to Moses is this: "My presence and my beauty are too much for you to be able to see and actually continue living. There's just too much there. It's too pure. It's just too weighty. There's just too much of my presence and beauty there for you to be able to see me face to face in all of my fullness and all my glory and yet continue to breathe. So here's what I'm going to do, Moses. I'm actually going to meet you here, and I'm going to put you in a sort of outcropping of these rocks here. And I'm going to put my hand in front of you, and then when I pass by, take it away so you can see my back." Now, we see in Exodus 34, that actually happens. God passes by Moses, and Moses sees sort of the back of God's head or the train of his robe. And then later on, it says that after this encounter, Moses, his face began to just shine, radiate. And it was so much that the people around him, once he came down from the mountain, the people around him were like, "Moses, dude, you got to put a sheet over your head, man. It's just, we can't see you. It's just too much." Can you just imagine that for a minute? How incredible would that have been? Just seeing the back of God's head was so magnificent. The beauty and the presence, just a fraction of it, were so great that just the mere presence of that little bit of God, of Yahweh, was enough to make Moses' face just glow in the dark. Now, throughout the Old Testament, we see this glory of God show up in a few different instances. It later says in Exodus chapter 40, a few chapters away, that God's glory, his presence, came down in a cloud. It looked like a cloud, and it settled on top of the temple, which is kind of like the Old Testament version of the church building. And it was so thick, and God's presence and God's beauty was so thick that they couldn't even have church. Moses and the priests were like, "We're going to have to kind of postpone this thing because God's glory is just too thick here." In the book of Judges, we see that God's glory kind of encompasses or it invades certain human beings, like a guy like Samson, who had this incredible, amazing strength. God's glory and his presence came into Samson, and he literally brought the house down. And later on in the book of Habakkuk, it says that God's glory covers the earth like the waters cover the sea. And on you see these stories of prophets or priests or even poets who talk about, or maybe even for a moment embody, the glory of God, but it seems to be scattered and not very consistent. But then a few hundred years later, something happens that absolutely changes everything. Look with me in John chapter 1. We're going to go to the New Testament. John is the fourth, what's called gospel or biography of Jesus. In John chapter 1, starting in verse 1, it goes like this. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. And all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. That's a mouthful. In him, that's the Word, was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. This is very kind of reminiscent of the way the whole story of the Bible begins in Genesis 1, where it says, in the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. And what John is trying to do is he's trying to tie us back to that presence of God at the very beginning, of Yahweh at the very beginning, saying that there was this Word, this God Word that existed, and everything was made through him. And this God Word created everything in existence, visible and invisible. But then skip down to verse 14 and look at what John says. It says this, and the Word became flesh. Literally, it put on skin. This Word had meat and bones and tendons and sinews and a heartbeat, and it dwelt among us. I love what Eugene Peterson's translation of this passage called The Message. I love what he says here. He says that the Word moved into the neighborhood. So here we have this Yahweh that is sort of transcendent, but all of a sudden kind of coming down and putting on flesh and bone and skin and becoming one of us and moving into the neighborhood. And then it keeps going. Look at the second half of verse 14. It says, and we have seen his, that's this Word, we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Did you catch that? It says that we, you and I, have seen this Word's glory. It's the same word used in Exodus 33, chabod. We have seen the presence and the beauty of Yahweh. And he has become a person. He has moved into the neighborhood, not just some far off and distant deity, but he has moved into our community. He has put on flesh, and he is here. And it is what John says later on through the person of Jesus Christ. So here we have Moses having this conversation with God. And Moses says, God, I want to see your beauty. I want to see your presence. I want to understand what you look like in manifest ways. And God says, Moses, you can't. Nobody can see me and live. And then God sort of does this spiritual move. And John says, and through that move, we have seen God's presence and God's beauty become flesh. Verse 16 keeps going. It says this, for from his fullness, this Word made flesh, from his fullness we have received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. It's like the 10 Commandments were given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Nobody has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. Once again, Eugene Peterson translates it this way. He says, no one has ever seen God. Not so much as a glimpse, but this one-of-a-kind God expression who exists at the very heart of the Father has made him plain as day. Here's what this means. The beauty and the presence, the love and the justice of God, of Yahweh, the chabod of Yahweh, are embodied and made known through Jesus of Nazareth. So if we want to know what Yahweh is like, if we want to know what the beauty and the presence of God is like, we have to look at the life of Jesus. There's one story, it's actually a story in a story, that I love, that really just paints a beautiful picture of this. It's in Matthew chapter 9, if you want to flip over there with me. Matthew is the first biography of Jesus in the New Testament. But in Matthew chapter 9, in verse 18, there's this amazing story about Yahweh and his beauty and his presence interacting with humanity. Look at this. It says this in verse 18. It says that while he was saying these things to him, this is Jesus that it's talking about. While Jesus was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler of the synagogue came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." And Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. And behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe or the edge of his garment. For she said to herself, "If I only touch his garment, I will be made well." And Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly, the woman was made well. And when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl's not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went through all that district. In Jewish culture, there were 4 types of people who were considered to be outsiders or really far from God. The first were what were called the Gentiles or the non-Jews. The second were women. The third were children. And the fourth were the sort of persistently or terminally ill. And what we see in this story is that Jesus, Yahweh made flesh, are fully invested in the lives of 3 of these 4 individuals. Right? We see him interacting with this woman, this daughter, and this woman who had a terminal or a perpetual illness. And if that wasn't enough, we also see him interacting with a ruler of the synagogue. Now, here's why that's interesting. Because if you remember, if you keep reading in the story, you discover that it's the rulers of the synagogue, it's the Jewish religious leaders that are trying to conspire together to kill Jesus. So here we have outsiders and enemies of Jesus interacting with God's beauty and God's presence made manifest in Jesus of Nazareth. And what do you see happening? I mean, do you see God's beauty in this? Do you see God's presence in this? Like Moses is like, "God, show me your glory, show me your beauty, show me the fullness of your presence." And John and Matthew say that God became flesh, made his home here, and we see his beauty manifest in everything that Jesus does. You know, if you're looking at this, one of the things that you can tell that's glaringly absent in this day and age and in our situations, in your life and in my life and our work lives, is that while we read about this God made flesh in the Bible, Jesus isn't here right now. I mean, I didn't sit down this morning and have a cup of coffee face to face and hang out with Jesus. Right? I've never had a meal with Jesus. I've never gone running with Jesus. Like, I've never met him face to face. And chances are you probably haven't either. A few millennia ago, there was a guy named Paul who he had actually never met Jesus face to face either. But he had met some people who followed Jesus, who had met Jesus. And then there was this kind of strange story where Paul had this transcendent experience where he actually had a conversation with Jesus, even though he didn't really see him face to face. But this experience and knowing that these followers of Jesus transformed his life so much that he actually began to write letters to other followers of Jesus who had not met him either, to encourage them and to just help give them some sort of a light in guidance in the midst of following Jesus, but not really having seen him. And there's this one letter that he wrote to a group of people in a city called Colossae, and the letter is called Colossians. And I want to show you something in the book of Colossians that really, for me, honestly has just really weighed heavy but beautifully on my soul this week. Let's go to Colossians chapter 1. It's a little bit further on in the New Testament. If you go to Matthew and you kind of hang a right, you keep going past John, past Romans, past 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you're going to end up in the book of Colossians. In Colossians chapter 1, starting in verse 15, it says this: He, that's Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. This is the same language that John used about Jesus in John 1, where the Word became flesh, or in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, right? It's the same word that is used in Genesis 1, where in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That's what that's what Paul is saying here. He's saying that Jesus of Nazareth is the image of the invisible God. And then look at verse 16. It says this: For by him, that's Jesus of Nazareth, by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now, there's two things about these verses that I really think that are impactful for me, and I hope are impactful for you too. Let's just look at them quickly. The first is this: your life has meaning and purpose. One of the exercises that I like to do with passages like this, where it has a phrase that says like all things or all people, is I like to take out kind of maybe some of the samples there and put my name in there instead. So it would say something like this: for by him, by Jesus of Nazareth, Jason was created. Jason was created through him and for him. Sometimes I'll put my wife's name in there. Kelly was created through Jesus of Nazareth and for Jesus of Nazareth. My kids were created through him and for him. My marriage was created through him and for him. All things, every atom in existence, everything in your life and in my life were created through him and for him. Meaning, your life and my life has meaning and it has purpose, because you and I were made by someone else and for someone else. And until we really allow that reality to sink in, and until we discover who that someone is or why we were made for them, we will be lost and confused and jealous and bitter and really just kind of listless, wandering from one thing to the next. Ronald Rolheiser, whom I've quoted before, I love him. He says it this way. He says, in this life, all symphonies remain unfinished. Our deepest longings are never really satisfied. What this means, among other things, is that we are not restful creatures who sometimes get restless, fulfilled people who sometimes are dissatisfied, serene people who are sometimes experiencing disquiet. Rather, we are restless people who occasionally find rest, dissatisfied people who occasionally find fulfillment, and disquieted people who occasionally find serenity. We do not naturally default into rest, satisfaction, and quiet, but rather into their opposite. Here's the second thing this means for us. is that you and I were made for meaning and purpose. And while we are on this journey of discovery, our life is being held together by the beauty and the presence of God. Look at verse 17 for a second. It says this, it says, He, that's Jesus of Nazareth, is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Just pause and think about that for a minute. Jesus is the glory, the embodiment of God's beauty and God's presence. And everything is being held together by him. Meaning everything is being held together by the beauty and the presence of God in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. This is another place where you can practice that exercise I mentioned a minute ago, where you take out the word or that phrase, all things, and put your name in it instead. Jason is held together by the beauty and the presence of God in Jesus of Nazareth. That changes my life. That changes everything about me. Because my tendency is to be what Ronald Rolheiser said is disquiet or restless or aimless. I mean, that's my natural bent. I have doubts. I have doubts about my faith. I have doubts about my relationships. Night when I go to bed, many nights I go to bed and I feel like a failure as a parent. I feel like a failure as a husband. I feel like a failure as a coworker and as a boss. But in these moments, I just have to stop and remember that it's not my job to hold my life together. My life is being held together by the beauty and the presence of God in Jesus of Nazareth. Now, there are some obvious ways this kind of makes sense, right? I mean, if you think about it, a few weeks ago, my family and I went to the beach, and while we were there, one of my favorite things to do is to get up early before the sun rises, and I'll make myself a cup of coffee, and I sit on the deck, and I watch the sky go from black to navy blue to orange and purple and fiery red and yellow as the sun comes up over the ocean. And it's almost like if you watch, you can almost hear the sizzle of the sun as it just rises above the horizon. And in that moment, that's the beauty and the presence of God. That's Yahweh made flesh. It's Jesus of Nazareth holding that moment together. You can sometimes see this in a good cup of coffee, right? Or maybe dinner or drinks with friends, and you're laughing, and you're like, in those moments, you sense the beauty and the presence of God in those moments. But there are some not so obvious moments too. When you fuss at your kids because they just, your nerves are shot, and you're like, I just want peace and quiet. Right? When you argue with your spouse or your roommate or your boyfriend or girlfriend, and you're frustrated and you're just stressed out. When you're lonely and when you're in isolation, and you hear those voices of your past just hauntingly calling out your name again and again and again. And in those moments, the reality and the truth of this verse is still true. That even in those moments of disrest, of dis-ease, or of restlessness, in those moments, you and I are being held together by the beauty and the presence of God. Here's why that seems like good news, even though it may not seem like good news. It's because if all things are being held together by the beauty and the presence of God, then we can rest in the fact that there is nothing outside of his eyesight. Just like the woman who was following Jesus from the behind, and she grabs his robe, And she hangs on because she thinks, if I can just see, or if I can just touch the hem of his garment, then I can be healed. And in those moments, Jesus turns and he looks at her. Just like Moses saw the back of God's robe, but yet God couldn't turn his face for Moses to live. Jesus actually turns around. The beauty and the presence of God are staring at this woman face to face. And he says this, "You are healed. Your faith has made you well." Just think about the weightiness of that. Of this father who was probably in on the conspiracy to murder Jesus, but who was desperate enough to come to him and say, "I have no other options. Jesus, if you would just put your hand on her, she would come back to life." And Jesus, without condemnation, without any sort of snarky comment, follows him to his house. And the beauty and the presence of God to bring this little girl back to life. That's true in those moments. If those people are not off God's radar, then you are not either. You are being held together in moments of bliss and in moments of stress and anxiety. You are being held together by the beauty and the presence of God that is Jesus of Nazareth. So here's what I want to do. Okay, I want you to practice something with me this week. And I want you just to find a moment or multiple moments throughout the week just to allow that truth to wash over you. When you're with your coworkers and you're having a good time and you're with friends and you're just sharing life together. Or when you get that email from your boss that simply says, "I need to see you in my office." Or when you have that fight with your spouse about the same thing again and again. Or when you're with your kids, watching them sleep at night, resting with their eyes closed, just deep inhales in and exhales out. Regardless of what situation you find yourself in, I want you to remember that you and your life in those moments are being held together by the beauty and the presence of Yahweh made flesh. That is Jesus of Nazareth. Well, may the Lord bless you and keep you. And may he make his face to shine upon you, be gracious to you, and give you his peace and his presence. Hope Church, you are sent.